Welcome everyone to St. Louis County Library's virtual program, Understanding Native Trees and Shrubs, presented as part of the Partners for Native Landscaping webinar series. I'm Sarah Kuntz-Jones, the Adult Programming Coordinator for St. Louis County Library. And before we get started, I wanted to bring to your attention a few helpful tips in case this is your first Zoom webinar with us, or if it's been a while. Maybe you've just been catching us on YouTube. The webinar format means that you should be able to see and hear us, but we can't see or hear you. If you do need to be in touch, you'll be able to chat with us a little bit later. But for now, the chat will be closed. More about that in a moment. But we are recording, so anything you do miss or any questions you have about the presentation, you'll be able to revisit this material when the link is posted. And you'll also receive an email with that link to the YouTube post of tonight's webinar within a few business days. So you'll see that very shortly. We also have captioning available. If you want to make those larger or smaller, if you want to hide them or show them, you can do all that with the caption button in the Zoom window. So take a look at that if you'd like to make any adjustments. And then finally, if you experience any difficulties with your connection, we recommend you exit the webinar, move closer to your Wi-Fi router, wherever you may be, and click the link to rejoin that Zoom link to rejoin us. And as I said, we're recording, so if you miss anything, you'll be able to catch up on it. And as I mentioned, the chat will be closed during most of the program to kind of help manage. We have a lot of you joining us this evening, which we're delighted to have you here with us, and we look forward to your questions. So please hold on to those, and I will let you know when it's time to start asking. So we'll address the questions we can as time permits. So that's how that will work. So now I'd like to remind you that you don't have to have a library card or even be a resident of St. Louis County in order to enjoy our programming, whether that's in person or virtual. We hope that you enjoy yourself always, learn something new, definitely always, and that you share it with your family and friends. That's what we're here for, is to get the word out, to stoke some curiosity. So feel free to tell them something new that you learned tonight. This program is a part of a wonderful partnership, Partners for Native Landscaping. It's a webinar series that the library has been able to host the last few years. It's the penultimate event, so as far as the webinars go, and they do have other things happening this month, and those are an in-person workshop and plant sale on April 15th from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. at Powder Valley Conservation Nature Center. And then there's also a native plant fair with Beyond Housing on April 30th. I'm going to have a link to more information about those events, as well as the other things I mentioned here in a moment. I'll put those in the chat here, so you'll be able to access those when you have a chance. So the next program in the webinar series, the final program, is tomorrow, April 5th at 2 p.m. And it is a panel discussion about native landscaping with hungry deer. A question on many of our minds. So be ready to hear all kinds of good information on that tomorrow. That event, that webinar will also be recorded. And then as we finish up this series on native planting, we have welcomed back some programming on vegetable gardening as we head into our getting into our gardens with a little more enthusiasm maybe. And so on April 19th, Wednesday, April 19th at 2 p.m., Gardening 101 with C. St. Louis is on deck. So I'll have a link to that if you're interested in registering for that program as well. But you can register for these or any St. Louis County Library program by going to slcl.org/events. And don't forget that you can catch up on most any of our programs by checking out the library's YouTube channel. So all the previous programs in this series are there on YouTube. So you'll have time to enjoy those when you've got the space in your schedule and kicking back. So I'll have links to how to access that as well here in a moment. But now I would love to introduce you to our presenter. James, and I forgot to ask him in our practice session how to correctly pronounce his last name, so I'm going to give a very poor attempt here, but James Fopel, no.
Fopel.
Fopel. Oh, that was my instinct, and I didn't listen. James Fopel. He works for the Missouri Botanical Garden at the Litzinger Road Ecology Center. The Ecology Center is a 39-acre educational site in St. Louis County, where James is a supervisor of ecological restoration. There he manages invasive species and introduces native plants back into the restored prairies and woodlands, and does native plant outreach in the St. Louis region. James started out in horticulture, working in the nursery industry, and later in the design and landscaping trade. He has been with the Missouri Botanical Garden for 7 years now, and is also an active member and volunteer with Grow Native, St. Louis Wild Ones, and Missouri Native Plant Society. James has been working with native plants for 17 years and enjoys watching the diverse amount of wildlife they provide for rather, as well as opening the eyes of others to the amazing natural worlds that exist right outside their front door. And I hardly agree with that. So thank you so much for being with us, James. We really appreciate you joining us and forward to hearing your talk.
My pleasure. All right, share screen here.
Looks great.
All right. All right, so tonight's topic, I was asked by the partners to present on native trees and shrubs, and to present it in a very, broad way. So I'm going to be covering a lot of ground. We're going to kind of divide this up. So, I'm going to be talking about, a little bit about, why we should be planting them. Here, I'll go to the first slide. So, why we should be using native plants, using these native woody plants, these trees and shrubs. And then we'll dive into how you should be designing in these plants into your yard before you go out and buying them. A lot of people do the reverse. They'll go out and just go to the nursery and buy something and then try to find a spot for it in their home. That's the wrong way to do it. And then we'll start talking about how you should go about researching, what's the appropriate species to plant in your yard, and then how to plant them and the ongoing kind of care and maintenance of them. So we're going to be covering a lot of ground, and I'm going to be giving lots of resources for you to be able to continue on, because this is, each one of these subjects here that I have lined out could be their own presentations or, semester-long classes. So there's a lot of information out there that you can continue to dive into should you wish. All right. So first, a lot of you are probably already here, knowing, what a native plant is, why we should be using them, that kind of thing. But just in case this is kind of all new to you, I do want to kind of cover the basics here of why we should be using native trees and shrubs over some of the exotic species that are readily available commercially. All right. And many of you hopefully saw this in school. This is the diagram of the food web. This is, the main explanation of why we should be using native plants. They are pulling the sunlight, into their leaves, creating energy, storing that in their roots, and allowing other things to eat them, right? So plants are the beginning of the food web in most ways. And the unfortunate thing is again, being taught in school, this part here, they just usually say plants. The big difference here is that this really should be labeled as like native plants are the beginning of the food web, because that is what evolved in our ecosystems, and that's what the wildlife evolved to eat. So a lot of times exotic plant material just isn't serving those same kind of purposes in our food webs. So it is a kind of lopsided thing to put there, just plants. And so, a lot of people will go, their young adult lives up until adulthood and still have never heard of a native plant. I myself never actually understood this difference until I got to college. So, And that's kind of what drove me into this field, become so passionate about it. All right, so, kind of going back to that in the food web, if you saw the plants that you planted in your yard, you went out and bought these plants with your hard-earned money, and then you go out in your yard and you see that the leaves are getting tore up, would this bother you in your yard? Well, hopefully not, because this is why you're planting native plants. Inside that curled up little leaf on this spice bush here, our native spice bush shrub, is the spice bush swallowtail caterpillar. And it is a specialist caterpillar that can only eat this plant and one other in our area, the sassafras tree. So this little caterpillar can only eat 2 species of plants. If you don't have those plants in your yard, if all you had was some exotic species in your yard, you would not be able to attract this butterfly's caterpillar to your yard. And there's the beautiful adult butterfly of the spice bush swallowtail. And that 90% there represents how many herbivorous insects are specialists on plants. So 90% of all plant-eating insects specialize on, some kind of group of plant. Another big, really common one that a lot of people know about are the monarch butterflies, which specialize on milkweeds. So if you don't have milkweeds, you won't be able to attract monarchs. But again, we're talking about woody plants today, so I'm trying to focus on that. There's been lots of research within the last 10 or so years looking into the importance of native plants and their role in our ecosystems. One such study out of Delaware by Doug Talmy, if you've heard that name before, looked at just one little aspect of the food web, chickadees and the food that they raise their young on. And they were watching nest boxes of chickadees as the parents would come back and feed the babies their food. And they were counting on average 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars per clutch of eggs. So, that's a staggering amount of caterpillars and a staggering amount of native plant material that it's needed to produce that kind of food resource just for one nesting set of parents of chickadees. And then you have to think about, the rest of the birds out there. So 96% of our land birds feed their young insects as they're raising their young. And so it's not just the chickadees, it's just that one research project looked at that. And, those kind of numbers have really gotten a lot of people into, using native plants after hearing about that. But, so a lot of these other native bird species raise their young on insects as well. So 96% of our land birds. A lot of mouths to feed. And so a lot of native plants are needed to produce that kind of food. So then Doug Talmy's lab also looked into how productive our native species are and how productive exotic species are. I don't expect you to read this exhaustive list here, but this list has gotten a lot of attention as well because a lot of our native woody species are the big time producers on a lot of these moth and butterfly caterpillars. And Quercus is the oak genus. So our oaks here in the Eastern North America produce, or are food sources for 557 species of Lepidoptera caterpillars. And so you can kind of go down the list here from cherries to willows, the birch and cottonwoods, they're up at the top. These native plants are big time producers of insect larvae. And here's an example of just one of those getting pulled out. So one of our native understory trees, the Mexican plum, it's in the genus Prunus, which is able to host 456 species of Lepidoptera. So you'll kind of see this throughout some of my additional slides here. I'll have these numbers right by the names of some of the native trees and shrubs. And that's just to represent how much on that list of Doug Talmy's list, how many Lepidoptera caterpillars are supported by that species. And so again, just a lot of food being produced on our woody plants, on our native woody plants. And so it's not just those one, that one piece of the food web, not just the caterpillars. There's a lot of other insects and a lot of other types of wildlife early on in the food web that are reliant upon our native plants being around. And another type of wildlife outside of birds and butterflies is bees that gets a lot of attention. And in North America, we have over 4,000 species of bees present. In the state of Missouri here, we have over 450 species of bees throughout the state. And here within St. Louis, where I live, over 200 species of bees. And that's a shot of downtown St. Louis. You guys may recognize Forest Park, this big green space here, and these green spaces down here, the Missouri Botanical Garden and Tower Grove Park. But you can see how urbanized downtown St. Louis is here in the shot. And just amazing that we can have over 200 bee species within that area. All right, and so the caterpillars of those Lepidoptera caterpillars had a lot of specialization on our native plants, and so bees are the same. We have in Eastern North America, 25% of our bees are specialists, and some of the biggest producers or hosts for those bees are the dogwoods, cherries, willows, and gooseberries. The dogwoods, cherries, and willows were all really high up on Doug Tallamy's list for the Lepidoptera caterpillars. So you might be seeing some trends here. So the woody plants are being very supportive of some of these specialists. This is the last shot there was a willow flower with a specialist mining bee on it. And this is a specialist mining bee on a dogwood flower. And so back to those numbers for here in Missouri, it's pretty staggering. Actually, here in our state, we have over those 450 species of bees in Missouri. About half of those are oligolectic, and that's a specialist. So they're specializing on groups of plants. So like this bee that you see here, it's a specialist on shrub dogwood flowers. So, it can go to more than just one species, but it is still considered a specialist. It's not going to other family groups of plants. And even outside of bees, other types of insects are specialists on our woody plants. Here on the left side, you see a locust borer, which is pollinating goldenrod. It's going to be easily seen on goldenrod, but it's early in its life cycle. As a larval stage, it is on the inside of a locust tree, boring through it and eating it. So similar to a caterpillar, just not on the outside eating the foliage, it is on the inside of the tree eating the tree. But it is a specialist on those locusts. And here on the right, we have some tree hoppers that are specialists on these redbuds. And then there's all types of wildlife that are predating on those types of insects as well. So, if we're, interested in birds, if we're interested in these things, bird feeders can't cut it. Even the adults of these birds are going to be eating insects, not just the young when they're in the nest. So those are the kind of big considerations you need to think about when deciding to, go out and buy a tree. Why should you be buying the native trees and shrubs? All right, so now we're going to go into the next part of this presentation, and that is talking about understanding your personal space in your yard and how to design for yourself and local wildlife within that. So how to make sure that your site is, suitable for these plants, and how to best design them into the space. Some of the basics that you need to be thinking about when you're doing any kind of planting, not just for woody plants, is just understanding the site. So these are the basic types, basic considerations you need to be looking at before deciding to buy any kind of plant. And so these first three are the main conditions that they're going to be growing in and are going to affect the type of plant that you're going to be selecting. And so that's the sun or shade, so how much of daylight they're going to be receiving in a day. The soil conditions, in St. Louis, we're a very urbanized area and we can have pretty deconstructed soils. So you really need to look at your soils before planting a plant. And the soil moisture levels. And then along with that, things that can affect some of these things is like the downspouts and water movement on your property. You want to make sure that you're fully aware of those. The topography is going to have effects on all of that, as well as existing structures, making sure that you're accounting for where you're going to be placing this tree that may be really small when you buy it, but it's going to get to be really big if you've done your research and you've looked into it. You wouldn't want to plant that near the house. And then, of course, with a lot of our woody plants, wind should be a big consideration. If you're on an area that doesn't have many structures or existing plant material that's going to be blocking the wind, you need to be taking that into consideration as well. And hopefully you've heard this phrase before, but the right plant, right place. It's very important for when siting plants in your yard, right? So that phrase is just meant to kind of remind you to capture all those details that we just discussed. One thing that a lot of folks do when they get into gardening is get lots of horticulture books, which can be great for giving you ideas on which plants you might want to select, because of somebody's recommendation in these books, or just how beautiful they are to you, that kind of stuff. But I want to make sure that you take pause, that these are not the kind of books that should be making decisions for you. These should just be like idea books, things that should be, giving you an idea of what might be available to purchase and are ideal for you. But we're going to get into some of the better things to be looking at instead of this. And of course, we're presenting on behalf of the county library here. Any of the books that I show in here, make sure you can look them up at the library's computer systems and request them. All right. So how should woody plants be used in a managed landscape? I try to give lots of real world examples for to give people an idea of like how these things should be used in design. And one of the ways I like to do that is most people can relate to interior design in your home. And so when it comes to woody plants, they play a specific role in the garden and garden design. And so large, big, shade trees, your overstory trees, these are the things that I would be considered the ceiling of your garden. They're going to have drastic effects in the long run on how your garden performs. And then smaller trees and larger shrubs can be used as hedges or backdrops. And I refer to these as the walls of your garden space. And then the focal plants, some of these more aesthetically pleasing trees and shrubs, understory trees, are going to be the things that you're using as the focus, the anchor. This is what your eyes are going to be drawn to, and I tend to refer to these things as like the furniture in your design. And then we're not getting into it today, but like the herbaceous plants, like your annuals, your grasses, your perennials, that kind of stuff, those are what we would consider like the decorations. So that ends up being like the last step of your garden design. Since we're looking at woody plants tonight, we're just kind of focusing on how they should be used. And again, your large scale trees, whether you're planting them at a young age or not, or if you have big existing trees, they are the ceiling of your garden ultimately, and they're going to affect the long-term, planting systems within your garden. And then more on the design side here, like the more aesthetic side, are going to be the things that are being used as walls. So these are going to be, larger plantings as like backdrops, things like that, or hedges. There's going to be containing in your garden spaces. And then again, your focal plants are the furniture. So these are the things that are going to be where your eye is being drawn to. So like the serviceberry here, or the red buckeye. Okay, so The next step of this is like once you've actually started drawing out your landscape design and kind of planning out where these plants might go in the future. Again, these are just placeholders. You know, you don't need to be picking out species just yet. You need to be picking out an idea of what kind of plant you want to look for in the future. Once you start getting into picking out species, one of the things that you want to design for is the season-long bloom, and then, you know, a long period of fruit availability for like things like birds and mammals, you know, for the wide variety of wildlife, but that long bloom season for pollinators to try and keep something consistently blooming throughout the year, so that they can stay in your area and not be wasting their energy. And that way you're also attracting a diverse amount of species to your yard as well, because you'll be probably attracting potentially different types of specialists. All right, just kind of an example of, you know, what I'm talking about here. You know, species that can be kind of picked out for this kind of, you know, season-long bloom period. The witch hazels are pretty interesting. We have 2 native witch hazels in Missouri, and they are kind of the end caps of the entire season. The Ozark witch hazel blooms in like January to February, and so that's kind of starts off the spring season for us at the end of winter. And then the eastern witch hazel is at the very end of the season, usually blooming in November, one of our last native woody plants to bloom. So they're a nice beginning and finish for the seasons. You know, following not too far behind the witch hazels at the very beginning of spring is one of our first native shrubs, the spice bush, to bloom. And again, just reminding you guys, the little number there is just calling back to the Doug Tell Me list. So like how many Lepidoptera it supports. You may be like, oh, 11, that's not that many. But don't forget it supports a specialist caterpillar that's relying on the spice bush to exist, right? And then they're small little yellow flowers just that get you kind of excited for spring. The leaf, you know, no leaves are out yet. And so it's just this little pop of yellow in the woodlands. And this is good for like a moist woodland area. Also a great replacement for bush honeysuckle if you're removing a bunch of bush honeysuckle on your property and you still want some kind of shrub cover for privacy or something like that. Spice bush is a good one for more moist soils where shrubs have been removed, things like that. But it attracts a whole host of wildlife from pollinators, and then you know, gorgeous fall color in the fall, but it also produces berries later in the season for wildlife. One of my favorites is the serviceberry. And I got the scientific name up here because there's quite a few other serviceberries out there on the market. And a lot of people generally ask, you know, well, which serviceberry is it? This is the specific species of serviceberry. Serviceberries are a big producer for Lepidoptera caterpillars, but it is also a really important one for early season pollinators like this queen bumblebee, just emerging from her overwintering nest cavity. And again, beautiful fall color and great fruits. They're kind of an early season fruit. They produce in June. Really great one for birds, really great one for us, really tasty, but you got to beat the birds to it. And willows are great producers. They're not necessarily that great for the home landscape. Prairie willows are a really great one though for the home landscape. It's probably one of our smaller willows, and it also doesn't need a ton of water. Like it doesn't need to be in a moist spot like a lot of our other willows. And again, I just need to kind of pick up the pace on going through here. Again, this is just kind of to show the kind of rate of change in the spring season for some of these trees and shrubs. You know, some of these, and I should say a large, you know, majority of our woody plants bloom in springtime. And so there's not as many choices as you start getting later into the season for bloom times on your native trees and shrubs. So do know that you need to try and, if you do want to have blooms during that time period, you're going to have to get a little bit more specific in targeting some of those species. But know that a lot of these spring species can have, you know, really big delays between their fruiting times. And so if you're trying to, you know, plant for birds, you know, even though the serviceberry and the flowering dogwood bloom really close together in spring, their fruits are being produced at two very different times of year, whereas the serviceberries fruit are being eaten by birds in June. The flowering dogwoods berries are not going to be eaten until the leaves are dropping off in fall, as you can see in this picture here. Yeah, going into like the viburnums, chokeberries, kind of pushing into a little bit later in spring. You can see that some of the flowers were already on with the leaves out. Here again, the gray dogwood producing berries later in the year, and its flowers when leaves are already out. Nine bark. American holly, or in some of our other shrub hollies, the deciduous hollies are really great to have because their berries won't actually be eaten until wintertime. And they are blooming in the latter part of spring, early summer. And I don't have, and I should have probably put in a couple of summer bloomers in here, but things like our wild hydrangea and shrubby St. John's wort are kind of like in the middle of summer. Those are some great ones for pollinators in there. And then towards the end of the season of summer, buttonbush, which is a really great shrub, is being pollinated by the bumblebee queens going into fall and about to be dormant over wintertime. So it can be kind of like towards that very end cap of the season for a lot of pollinators and an important species. All right, so you've now got the idea of why we should be using native plants, how you can be using them in your yard in a this kind of aesthetic manner, how to design them into the space. Okay, now how do I go about selecting these native plants for my yard? What are the species I should actually be picking? And so that is going to really depend on your site. So you're going to have to do a little bit of research into what your site is like and into the surrounding areas around you. So this is just a little bit about how to better understand your local ecosystems and the plants that are already growing there around you. All right, so how do you go about researching this? One of the best ways that you can do it is actually just, leaving your yard and going into some of your local natural areas around you, going out on hikes, taking a notebook with you. There are some great apps out there now that can help you with identification. You can go get field guides from the library if you don't already have some. And one of the apps that I generally recommend for folks to use, because it can be a bit of crowdsourcing for information and it's a little bit better information, is iNaturalist. And I'll come back to that here in a little bit. But then, outside of going to natural areas, let's say maybe you don't have that many, but you could then go to a local garden space and see what kind of species are being grown there. They might not necessarily be naturally occurring, but you might be able to see how well they're succeeding there. All right, and then I'm going to give you quite a few number of resources here in our area for how to try and find out additional information on these species that you're coming across. All right, and here's just an example. If you lived around here in St. Louis in like the Kirkwood area, or if you're familiar with the Kirkwood area, you could go to the Powder Valley Nature Center, which is right there within Kirkwood, and it is an uphill kind of natural area. And so let's say your yard is a more, it's a drier site. You don't, you're having to water your lawn if you had a lawn, and you're wanting to try and get rid of it, and you're wanting to cut back on water. What are these plants that can tolerate this dry situation? That's the kind of site you would want to go to. So that's a more uphill, rockier topography, natural area. And then right next door to Powder Valley Nature Center, right across the highway, is Emmenegger Nature Park. And it is a river bottom floodplain area. And so you could go to a place like that if you had a wetter yard. So try and target natural areas near you that have similar siting locations as you. That way you can really, kind of learn from nature about what kind of plants can survive in your soil types, in your moisture conditions, okay? And then also right there in Kirkwood is St. Louis Community College Merrimack, which has a big horticulture program. And you can go see their planted gardens and arboretum. They're using native plants in a space like that. And there's examples like this that I could give you all over St. Louis, but just a little bit of research, just even going onto Google Maps, zooming out and looking at the green spaces nearby you, you'll be able to find and pick out the different types of parks and stuff near you. All right. So when I use the word native, it is a term that can get kind of questioned a bit, like what is a native plant? And a lot of people will just generally say like, oh, it's a Missouri native plant. So you may go to a nursery and they have the labels on it saying this is a Missouri native plant. I'm just going to buy that, put it in my yard because it's a native plant, even though it might not necessarily be grown anywhere near you naturally. So why I would want you to do a little bit of research in the plants that can naturally grow near you is just because it's going to give you a better rate of success, and it's going to be better chances that you're actually helping out local wildlife. And there's a lot that you can go into when you're trying to dig into this kind of information about, what kind of plant is native to your area, right? This is kind of just the level 1 of the ecoregions for Missouri and the rest of the surrounding states for us here. According to this map, we're part of the Eastern Temperate Forests, and the northwestern half here of Missouri is the Great Plains. So this is just like the lowest level, trying to just give you a basic idea of the type of ecosystems we're living in. This goes pretty deep, though, if you are interested in going and finding out more than just that. This is very basic, just telling you like, oh, we're in the Eastern Temperate Forest, so all the plants that are over here in this green area must be native to this area, right? That's not the case. So it goes in quite a bit deeper than that. Just diving in just a little bit more, breaks it into 4 different ecoregions. And again, here in St. Louis area, we're now seeing that we're about a part of 2 different types of ecoregions. Go a little bit deeper and it starts getting divided up a little bit more. Now we're seeing 6, but here in St. Louis, again, it's still only those 2. So the plants in this lighter color here are not going to be the same type of plants growing in this area over here. So these 2 specific ecoregions are going to have 2 totally different sets of plants. And you're like, okay, well, James, that doesn't seem like there's that many choices. I can just figure out between the 2 which one I live in. That's not how plants are generally working. They can be a lot pickier than that and a lot more specific. And so once you go into like this 4th level, you can see that it is not very basic at all. This is the actual reality of it. So when you see a plant labeled Missouri native plant, know it could be coming from any one of these different types of ecoregions. And this is all based upon moisture conditions and soil conditions and like the parent, like bedrock material. So, some of this is going to be clay, some of this is going to be sandy, some of this is going to be basic or, alkaline type soils, and some of it's going to be acidic type soils. So plant growing up here in the St. Louis area, most of if you're in the St. Louis area, it's, what a lot of people call very clay-like soils, things like that. But then you find out that we have a Missouri native azalea. It's like, oh, I want that beautiful flower in my yard, but it grows down here in this ecoregion, and that's a much sandier soils and it's more acidic. You try to plant that in the St. Louis area, just like if you're planting any of the other exotic azaleas or rhododendrons, things like that, that it's not going to necessarily succeed in the St. Louis area if you've gardened with those before. So it does benefit to do a little bit of research into where these plants are coming from, even though they are considered a Missouri native plant. And if you are not living in the St. Louis area, you may be in one of these many other types of ecoregions, and it's just going to be very important for you to like really find out what those plants are that are growing near you. And again, this is still not even as deep as if we went into like on the county level of the different types of little ecoregions, even within those smaller spaces. So just like I was saying, there species that are growing at Powder Valley Nature Center are not going to be necessarily the same species growing at Emmenegger Nature Park, which is just across the highway from it. And if you want to dig into more information on this, this is a really great book on that subject. I don't think it's in print anymore, but I think it's still available for purchase, maybe from the state parks. But you might be able to find this at the library. A really good book, and it talks about the different plants that grow in each one of these little different ecoregions across the state. So it's a really great resource. I wish it was a little bit more readily available. And I wish the information from this book was available online. All right. Here's some additional resources for you for trying to find out information on what plants kind of grow in your area. Missouri's Grow Native website has a plant info or plant picker, and I'm going to move on to the next slide, and you'll be able to see some details on that. And then the National Wildlife Federation, you may have heard about this native plant finder that they have by zip code. It's not necessarily like the best resource, but it can give you an idea of like, by zip code, some of the like groups of plants that grow in your area. It's not necessarily going to be really super specific, and it's not necessarily going to be like, the best information, but it's at least a good starting point. The Grow Native website, on the other hand, it's got all these different details that you can enter in to try and sort through, like the plants that they have in their database, that can go into these different features. So, you can click on the different types of sun, soil, fall color, all these little different details will filter out different types of native plants for you. Hopping back to the Powder Valley Emmenegger conservation area kind of example, I had mentioned iNaturalist earlier, and it's a really cool website that you can use as an app on your phone for trying to help identify stuff. But it's also this website that'll like, keep track of all the things you found, and it's keeping track of everything that everybody's entered into the computer program. So it's a really great resource if you want to do searches. And so you can go into the filters in the upper right here and click on different types of conditions. Like you can search for like Emmenegger Nature Park, and you can click on just plants. So I can just see all plants that are growing within Emmenegger that people have put in there. And so you can see that there's already been 1,000 plants people have seen there. It's not necessarily going to be like, oh, every single plant, that is growing on property. You can see that the pins don't cover every single square inch of the property. And it's only covering 320 species, but that's a lot. But you could just go onto this website and start looking and seeing like what kind of things people saw there. So there's ways for you to find out information on the kind of stuff that grows near you pretty easily if you know the resources and know how to dig into them, how to use lots of these filters and things. Some really great book resources on native trees and shrubs are The Trees of Missouri and the Shrubs and Woody Vines of Missouri by Don Kurz from the Missouri Department of Conservation. Two really great books. Again, don't think they're in print anymore, but you may be able to find them like at the library or online. Just two really great beginner type books for people really starting to get into these subjects. He has like county maps where the trees are found by county and the types of habitats they grow in, that kind of information, and when they bloom, all that kind of stuff. So these are like good, like large field guide books for you. All right. And again, this is being recorded. Feel free to take photos of the screen or take screenshots, whatever you need to do to try and capture some of these resources I'm handing out here. But these are three really great like databases for information. Like once you already like know the specific plant, like you've been able to identify it in some way when you've gone out and seen it. These are really great sites to find out the info on like their growing conditions, other types of information about like pollinators, their full sizes, that kind of stuff. So for Missouri specifically, if you're in Missouri, the MissouriPlants.com, which is ran by the Missouri Native Plant Society folks, they have this really great website based off of the Missouri Flora books. And you can find a lot of the species grown in there. And then if you're in Illinois, they have IllinoisWildflowers.info. Another great resource, same kind of thing. It's a little bit more botanical, just like the Missouri Plants. And they also, and I should say both of these have ways that you can kind of like search for plants by like in a field guide sense. The MissouriPlants.com one has ways for you to like help identify things by like flower color, like a field guide would. And then Illinois wildflowers.info's got you can pull by habitat. So let's say you were in a prairie and you saw this wildflower, you can click on the prairie section and you can scroll through all the different plants that they have in that list. So both are really good resources, and Illinois, Missouri plants, lots of crossover there, but both really good resources. Whether you're looking at the same species in Missouri and you went to IllinoisWildflowers.info, you'll find out great information. And then Missouri Botanical Gardens Plant Finder is a really great website for finding out different information more on the gardening side of things. All right. So again, the where is a plant native to question gets asked a lot. And iNaturalist is not necessarily going to be a good site for that. So like if you were searching with like their filters, to like see where the plants are found now. Now is not the point in time where things were once native. We've really moved plants around a lot. This website called bonap.net is a really great resource if you're wanting to find out what counties, what states and what counties a plant is native to. These are based off of herbarium collections. So like where the plants were actually found quite a long time ago and specimens were pressed and put into a botanical garden or a college, university herbarium. And so these are based off of older records. And so how Bonap works is you can go on there, type in the genus. So like here, the example I took was viburnum. I put in just like into Google viburnum Bonap, and that was my Google search. And it pulls me to this link. And it pulls up all the viburnums found in North America here, or in the United States, I should say, and the states and counties that they're native to. And so you can see here, I clicked on Viburnum prunifolium, which is the black haw viburnum, very much native to the state of Missouri. You can see it's almost in every single county, according to Bonap. And, it's a great resource. Like, so, you can tell that, if you were almost everywhere in Missouri and you planted the shrub, you'd be doing, the right thing. Like it's a shrub that is pretty versatile across Missouri and the different soil types and the different, growing conditions that we have here. It's a pretty widespread native plant. And you can see it's, zoomed in here. It's definitely present in St. Louis County and St. Louis City. So a really great resource, and it's a really easy one to use. Again, you don't even need to go into their search bar. You just type in the genus of a plant that you're looking for and the word Bonap into Google search, and it'll pull up the link for you. That'll take you to this big group genus, page here. And then you can click on the specific of the ones that you're looking for. All right. So this is starting to get into some of the a little bit more nitty gritty stuff. When you're selecting your native plants, it can be hard to find native plants sometimes. And then on top of that, as a native plant horticulturist and ecologist, I really try to recommend that you're using plants that are sourced nearby. So just like how you're going around and looking for the plants in your local area, you want to try and find plants that have been sourced within that area. You don't want to go out and get a, let's say you went to Powder Valley Nature Center and you saw a chinkapin oak there growing on the hillsides there in their soil conditions they have there, and you wanted a chinkapin oak planted in your yard. Well, you wouldn't want to go and buy a chinkapin oak from, somewhere way outside of the St. Louis area. Let's say, in Illinois somewhere, really far in Illinois or Ohio, something like that. Like you don't want to try and get something that's been so sourced so far away. You want to really try and get it as local as possible. That way it's a species that's been acclimated to our growing conditions here. It's not outside of, our, temperature growing conditions and our moisture level conditions. And it's also going to be genetics that are closely sourced to the insects that are, living here locally. And then on top of that, cultivars gets brought up a lot when it comes to buying plants. And so a cultivar is a cultivated plant, and the word nativar gets used a lot for the native cultivars. And so it's not a different thing. It's just a catchphrase for a cultivar of a native plant. And a cultivar is a plant that has been cultivated to be different in some way. It's been selected. So a really good example of that is the river birch. A lot of the river birch people see in people's yards, the ones that they have like this, really great creamy, big peely bark, looks really papery even at an old age, is a cultivar that's called heritage river birch. And there's even other cultivars out there now of that. But every single one of that heritage river birch that you see in somebody's yard or in a commercial landscape somewhere is the exact same plant. It is a cloned plant. So that's the exact same individual planted all over the place. So as you can probably see, what the problem with that is that genetic strain of plant is just far spread, farther than it should be. And so, that can have potentially, odd effects to the other plants in the community if it were to cross over with them, that kind of thing. So, and if something were to happen to that plant, let's say a disease came in and the heritage river birch was really susceptible to it, all the heritage river birch around are going to be affected, and we might lose a whole bunch of them. So it's good to have diversity, and it's good to have this like local genetics versus the faraway genetics. Now, if you are going to use a cultivar because you have like a small space at home or something like that, there are reasons to use a nativar or a native cultivar. And one of those things that I recommend is that the dwarf cultivars are all right, because especially with native plant landscaping, we're constantly working with small spaces. And when you have a dwarf cultivar, it's not necessarily affecting the plant outside of just being a smaller specimen. However, there's research out there on when plants have been changed into like different foliage colors or different flower colors, that insects don't recognize them in the same way. And then if the flower shapes have been altered, then those aren't going to necessarily work hardly at all. And I'm going to go through some examples here to help you, kind of understand these different situations. All right. So a lot of times a cloned plant, especially when it comes to woody plants, since we're talking about trees and shrubs, most of the time they are cloned by grafting. Sometimes they'll be cloned by cuttings, but a majority of them are going to be through grafts. And so this is the base of a white redbud cultivar. So this is a white redbud, and you can see the flowers here, and you can actually see the graft union on this specimen. And so that's just where the two plants individuals were put together when they were younger, and there you can kind of see the swollen spot where they're growing together. But below that graft union, you can see, because redbud flowers in old wood, you can actually see some of these flowers blooming down on the rootstock of the just straight species redbud. White redbud, even for this is a perfect example of how flower color can affect things. I myself have firsthand experience of being in a park where, taking inventory of pollinators at some of our native redbuds with their traditional purple to pink flowers. And they were just full of our native bees and other pollinators in them. Right next to that was planted a white redbud, and there was very few pollinators in there, and most of them were the European honeybee. So it was a pretty big, drastic difference in what was visiting these two individuals. And so more than likely, the white flower color is just not being as visible to the other pollinators that were visiting the pink or purple ones. It's possible there was some other issue going on there too with that, potentially, like available pollen and nectar resources. But more than likely it was the color affecting it. Sorry, my puppies want to be held. I love this shot. This is not a native plant. This is a weeping cherry, but it is a perfect example of how grafts can fail. And just to let really let you understand what's happening with these plants when they're cloned like this. You can see here on the right the like umbrella shaped weeping cherry that had been grafted on top of the straight cherry base. And you can see here below the graft union, right below the weeping cherry, the main rootstock that is the main trunk sent off a side shoot and is now surpassing in height the weeping cherry. So this is the straight species cherry that they had used, another probably a different type of Japanese cherry, and then the weeping one right here on the side. This is an example of the types of leaf color change that we can see a lot of times with these native trees and shrubs. And like this is red buds again as an example. They have these specimens, they have yellow leaves and they have ones that purple leaves. And there's been research done that leaf-eating insects do not find these leaves as palatable as the green, just straight species green leaves. All right, I got a couple of videos here to show of some examples of flowers that have been changed. This is the straight species native hydrangea shrub, and the pollinators that visit it, like the bumblebees and the beetles and all kinds of stuff, just go into town on these flowers, collecting lots of pollen. So lots of available resources for them. All right. And then here is the cultivar or native cultivar, if you will, of the native hydrangea. But this time it is the flower structure has been drastically changed to be showier for our eyes, but unfortunately not allowing for available resources for our pollinators. And it becomes kind of a pollinator trap, if you will, because the pollinators will still come because they're attracted by the color and by the flowers, and then there's not resources available to them, and they've expended energy getting to the flower itself. And so that first shot of the native hydrangea was right nearby these cultivated hydrangeas. Oops, why did that one not play? There we go. And so this is just panning over the entire hedgerow of this, whereas the other was just one individual native hydrangea, was just covered with pollinators. As you can see, just going down this whole hedgerow, just no action whatsoever happening on it. All right. And we're talking about flowers and some of the details on how that works. I get asked so often because a lot of our native trees and shrubs are monoecious, which means that they have both the male and female flower parts on the flowers on just one plant. And then we have dioecious trees and shrubs, which means that there's an individual male flower or male plant, and then there's an individual female plant. So a lot of times in this case, when there's dioecious plants, folks will have a hard time, because you're wanting these plants for wildlife and you're wanting to produce fruit, things like that. Well, if you don't have a male and female plant, then you're not going to be able to get the fruit production. And so typically nurseries aren't labeling their plants as male and female. So you're going to have to do that work on your own. So if you were wanting to buy, like, let's say a spice bush, which are these flowers here on the right, you would have to sex them during the time period that they're blooming. So here on the upper right is the male flowers, and you can see the pollen out here on the stamen. So, that's, how you can tell. So there's just stamen on the male flowers. And then if you go to the female spice bush flowers, it's going to be nothing but the pistils on them. Okay, so they're going to be the ones producing the fruit. So it's always going to be the female flowers producing, or female plants producing the fruit. So plants with female flowers, and when it's a dioecious species like spice bush, you have to have both sexes to be able to produce fruit, but it's going to be the female plants. Now here on the left is another native spring flowering shrub, leatherwood, and you can see here it has the stamens with the pollen on the ends, and then you can actually see the pistils here in the middle. So this is a monoecious plant. It's got both male and female flower parts on their flowers on the same plant. However, if you want to have your leatherwood produce fruit, most plants still need to have cross-pollination. It's just not going to be hard for you to get cross-pollination and get fruit with leatherwood, because all you got to do is buy two different, genetically different plants. It's going to be a lot harder when it's a dioecious plant. So doing a little bit of homework before you go out and buy a plant into how it reproduces, if that's what you're really interested in. So a lot of people, this is probably one of the most common plants in the native plant horticulture world that people, are, having issues with, trying to, they're like, I'm not getting any fruit. What's going on? You have to look really up close when the plants are blooming to be able to see those different sexual organs on these plants. Okay. And sometimes, when we buy these plants at a small size, they might not bloom for a couple of years. And so you won't be able to sex them until they've gotten old enough to even produce flowers. So just remember that cross-pollination is a must for most species of plants. So they're not going to be able to self-pollinate themselves. All right. So now we're going to get into, you've already figured out what plants you got. You've gone out and you bought them. You're back home with the plants. I'm going to try and wrap up here because we're pushing almost the hour limit. And I just want to give you the bare basics here again. So many of these different topics we could go into a lot deeper for a lot longer. But this is just kind of a general class here. But so when you're planting these trees, one of the catchphrases that I hope that you can remember is plant it high and it won't die. It's one way just to try and remember that do not plant your plants low. You want to plant your trees, your woody plants especially, where the root flare is above grade. Okay. As you can see in this photo, this is a potted plant. So this would have been in a black container pot here. They loosened up the roots as they're putting it in the hole. They dug it only as deep as the pot, just a little bit higher even, because they wanted to have, this go across and be above grade, so that if it settles at all, that root flare is still at ground level. Okay. When you are digging your holes for planting your trees and shrubs, make sure that you do not dig the hole too deep. Continue to put the plant into the hole that you're digging to kind of test the height. If you loosen the soil down here and you even pack it back in, it might still settle on you, and then it gets down potentially below grade on you. And that's where you're going to have issues in the future with like girdling roots or potentially rotting. Okay. So try to make sure that you're always planting high and your tree and shrub won't die. Okay. So lots of other things that can go wrong in the process, but that's one of the big main ones, especially for long-term health. Okay. And most people do recommend that you dig your hole a lot wider than your planting hole. If you were to dig the hole just as wide as your pot, you basically just put it into another pot, because that's not very loose soil. And the roots are going to hit that soil and start spinning inside there, and you could potentially get a girdling root from that. So dig it wider so that it gets a little bit of time for the soil to kind of slowly compact as the roots grow out. And so when it finally hits the untouched soil on the far outside edge, like in this right shot here, the roots will be able to go into that soil, no issue. Okay. Just, try and dig the hole a little bit bigger in width, not depth. And as far as watering goes, you're going to need to be watering your trees and shrubs for the first couple years. The first year, especially as it gets acclimated to the soil conditions. Hopefully within that second year, you'll be able to start pulling back on that watering But if we have a really hot summer, I still would highly recommend during its second year that you're out there watering it. But after that, if you've put the right tree or the right tree, the right shrub in the right place, so the right type of soil conditions, the right kind of growing conditions for that species, you should not have to ever water that again. Okay. These are plants that have adapted to our environment, and they should not need that extra assistance of watering from that point on. But only if you've chosen the right plant for the right place. All right. So we're going to get into the next step of like trying to take care of these plants beyond planting them and kind of keeping an eye on and watching them. And that's usually going to be pruning, because they're either going to be getting in the way of you or they've gotten damaged in some way, things like that. Pruning is an important part of plant care when it comes to woody plants. All right. And the three main reasons we prune, and that is for the plant's health, and then for the appearance and aesthetics of us, and for our safety. All right. So three strategies that I want you to go into pruning your plant with. And number one is preventative pruning. Okay, so it's just you going in, understanding the situation, and doing preventative pruning. So if you have a branch that's aiming at a sidewalk or aiming at the site of your home, and you're going to have to prune it, 5 years down the road, because it's now like, a really large branch and it's like running into your siding or damaging your awning, something like that. That could have been prevented many years ago by just simply understanding that that branch is currently in that spot and it's got the potential to go in that direction right now. And so preventative pruning is an important step in keeping your plant healthy, because any wounds that you give the tree later on in life from either cuts that you had to give, or if a branch breaks off and it, peels some of the bark, any kind of severing of a branch is a wound. And it does not heal like we heal. Woody plants compartmentalize, so that wound will forever exist. It's only that the plant will be able to seal up around it. And that's what compartmentalization is. It's not, a tree does not heal, it compartmentalizes. So it shuts down the plant cells around that area, and it starts growing other cells around it to try and cover it up. But that wound will forever exist in that woody plant. So anytime you take a pruner or a saw or anything to a woody plant, know that that wound will always be there. So it's better to do it now than later. And so that's part two here, is the sooner you do it, the better it is for the plant. So preventative pruning and then getting to it sooner is better than later. Oops, sorry. And then part three here of this, the third most important strategy I can recommend is you learning to understand these species. And that's just going to be kind of a give and take of experience. You might be able to research some of it online. I can't say there's a ton of information out there about how every species reacts to pruning, but there is some. But a lot of this is going to be gained from experience on your part. And pruning can be like an art form, and it's much like solving a puzzle, because every cut that you make causes a reaction from the plant. And so knowing how each species is going to react is going to be kind of like up to you, and being able to kind of like read those patterns over time. And so some of the reactions that I'm talking about for a plant to take to pruning is just going to be regrowth from that spot, or suckers or water sprouts from other areas on the plant. So those are a few types of reactions. And it can take a very long time to get to know these plants and how they act. So just be patient and know that everything doesn't have to be pruned immediately. Even though I said that, trying to do it sooner rather than later is good, only do as much as that you're able to. Don't go overboard and take off more than you should have. You can't put stuff back on the tree once you've pruned it off. All right. So where do you start when you get into pruning? And I'm going to get into some of the details here in pruning in just a second. But again, where do you start with this? You've got your tree or shrub that's been implanted in the ground for a few years, starting to look a little ratty to you. You got some, damaged branches, something like that. The first things that you want to go for and target are the dead and diseased limbs. So these are the things that are already, they don't have buds on them anymore. And you can test those for flexibility to see if they're dead. You can look at the buds and try and like flick at the buds if they don't look like they're nice and plump anymore. If they're dried off and they just pop right off by barely touching them. If you go to try and like bend the branch and it just snaps, without hardly any pressure, that's a dead branch. Crossing branches are important because those are going to be branches that are damaging each other. So they're just sitting there, in the wind, rubbing back and forth, causing friction and allowing for moisture and disease to get into those stems and those wounds. So doing preventative pruning, removing those crossing branches early on before they get to be too big and cause a big problem. And then thinning overgrown stems is going to be one of your last stops. So if you have a shrub that's really overgrown, one of the best things to do is go in and thin some of those larger canes out, things like that. All right. Now, to keep in mind when you're doing this kind of pruning is the structural kind of corrective cuts should be done mostly in winter time. So when the plants are dormant. This is when the plant's energy is down in its roots and there's no leaves on the plant anymore and it's not actively growing. So if you're doing a ton of removal, that's the time of year to do it. If you are in the growing season, you had some branches fall down, some broken branches, and you have to do some pruning during the growing season, just know at that time of year, you shouldn't ever take off more than 25% of the canopy of the plant. Doing more than that could really stress it out, especially when you're getting into summertime. And if we have a really harsh summer, do not prune in fall. The plants are starting to go dormant for the season. You do not want the plant to start growing again because you decided to prune off a couple branches. Now that it's, the leaves are starting to drop off, it's starting to change color, that kind of thing. And you go out and prune a couple branches, and then it's like, oh no, I just got damaged. My reaction now is to start growing. The heck with this going dormant thing. I need to recover. Do not do that, because then it'll produce those new leaves, new stems, and then gets those active stems. Once the first cold comes around and it freezes, it'll just damage and kill that part of the plant. And that could potentially be the entire plant. All right. A little bit on woody plant biology here, on some of the terminology on what you're looking at when you're looking at a woody plant. And this goes for a tree or shrub. Shrubs, this is going to be much smaller scale and, smaller to the eye. But these are going to be the same things that you're seeing on the plants. It's just a lot more visible on bigger trees. And this area where you have a main trunk and you have a side branch coming off, and you'll see like a little bit of the bark kind of coming up in a bit of a ridge, is called the branch bark ridge. And the swollen part on the lower side of a stem is called the branch collar. But the branch collar actually goes all the way around the tree. Like right here would be a part of the branch collar, and I'll show some real world pictures of this. This is a yellowwood. This is a really great example of this. Here's your branch bark ridge coming through here off the main trunk and the side branch here. And this is your branch collar, the swollen part. And this is just a really nice example of it, of having the smooth branch and a pretty rough looking branch collar that's nicely swollen. So if you were to prune this branch off because this branch out here is damaged, you're going to be making your pruning cut right here. You do not want to cut into your branch collar or the branch bark ridge. The tree and shrub will not be able to recover easily and compartmentalize that wound. All right, so you now know what this branch bark ridge is. This is a good attachment, seeing that kind of ridged up area. That's where two healthy parts of the plant are having their bark meet and push upwards and outwards. This is the healthy way of a plant growing. The bad part is when you have two pieces of plant material that are growing together, meet each other, and then actually work against each other and force downwards. And this creates a hollow space over time called included bark, where the two pieces of plant material are just pushing against each other. This is visualized by a V shape on the included bark, and then a U shape on these good connections where you have the branch bark ridge. So this is a bad connection. You cannot see the branch collar. That's because the branch collar is pushing against the branch collar of this side here. down into each other. Over time, this would just become a cavity for rain and snow and et cetera, and dirt to collect in. All right. So you now know the kind of conditions that you would want to be pruning for, you know where to be looking at, you're starting to actually go out with your saw or your lopper, and these are the areas that you're wanting to target. If you're doing a saw cut, you start out here on A, you can see here symbolizing just this little undercut, and that's to stop from peeling action happening. And you would start from B, heading to A with your second cut, removing all the weight out on the branch. And then closer up against the branch collar is where you're going to do the final cut. You're not going to want to do this C to X cut. That's where you would be cutting into the branch collar and permanently severely damaging the tree and not allowing it to compartmentalize. Again, you'll want to do this on trees and shrubs. It's not going to be as visible on a shrub, on these smaller shrubs, but know that the plant still recovers in this exact same way as their larger tree forms. Okay. Here's some examples of some bad pruning cuts. Pruning way out far away from the branch collar. It takes forever for the branch collar to go around and seal up around this. This is not what you want to do. You want to be right up close to the branch collar, and then you don't want to cut into the branch collar. You can see here it's trying to compartmentalize around this pruning cut, but the branch collar was damaged in the process early on the lower side of this branch. And so it'll never be able to fully compartmentalize around here, allowing for water and insects and fungi, etc., to even, permanently, in this case, have access to the interior of the tree and will rot out and create a hollow spot in the plant. This is what a good pruning cut would look like over time. Just a big donut sealing up around the damaged spot here. And then at some point in time in the future, actually meeting up and fully compartmentalizing around it. Again, that pruning cut is just going to be a permanent fixture with inside this tree, and it's been exposed to the elements this whole time. So it's of course started to rot on most species. Most species of plants don't have a way to permanently keep their interior wood from rotting. Some species have some really good chemicals that they inject in, like a juniper, that can keep their heartwood safe for a long period of time, but that is not the case for most species. They will, if it's a large enough wound, it just takes too long for the plant to compartmentalize around it, and it just allows for rot and decay to happen. All right. It's getting pretty late here, so I'm going to just kind of gloss over this bit here. I really don't have time to get into like the small nitty-gritty pruning. If anybody's got any questions, we can kind of talk about that. But I did want to just touch on like the shrub pruning here at the very end. Some of the terms that get tossed around are reductions, where you're actually like reducing the full size of the plant. You just want to make sure that you're never pruning beyond like the lowest buds, because you might not be able to have a spot for the plant to come back from to recover from the pruning cuts. But dormant season reductions on a lot of shrubs can work, but you need to do some research, make sure that the species you're pruning on can tolerate that. Not all can. And then on some of like the larger cane-like shrubs like ninebarks and viburnums, spice bush, any of these are like really big native shrubs that produce lots of interior canes, can be thinned out over time, allowing for new interior growth to kind of fill in and keep the shrub smaller and healthier looking over time. And so that's what the definition of thinning is. It's going in and targeting these larger stems or taking them down as low as you can, and then allowing for the plant to sucker back out of the ground and produce newer growth. Again, not all species can tolerate this. You're going to have to do a little bit of research to make sure what species you can, what you have, can tolerate it. And know that there's lots of resources out there. Once you have all these plants in your yard and you've been caring for them over time and you want to reproduce them, you want to propagate plants, there's lots of great resources on propagating native woody plants as well. And these are two really good books for that. All right. So Grow Native was mentioned early on. It's a great resource for a lot of things, from native plant selection to growers to landscapers. So make sure you go to that website to find out, where you can buy plants near you. And these are some of my favorites right around here in our area that produce a lot of, bigger quantities. These are some reliable sources for, a lot of big woody species. And again, there's lots of other growers out there in our area. Make sure to shop at them. Some of these smaller places can have some pretty cool stuff from time to time that some of these bigger growers might not have. But some of these bigger growers can be more reliable on, the quantities that you may need, that kind of stuff. And the Missouri Department of Conservation sells young whips each year. So make sure to check that out if you have not heard about that before. All right. So this is my contact info. If you need to get in touch with me, I'm on social media on a lot of spots, posting about native plants, etc. And I can take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, James.
Yeah.
I have the last two books I'll have to add to the list, but I'll be able to send out. I put all the things we were talking about and that you're talking about in the chat. So people have plenty of resources to explore. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So we had a question about, is there a good way to prune a leggy button bush? Was a question that came out. A couple of specific questions here, but yeah, that's one to start with.
So a leggy button bush can be a little bit of a problem because if it doesn't have any younger stems on it already, it's one of those plants that I wouldn't recommend necessarily doing a big reduction to. It's one of those plants that if you know early on, you can do some pruning on it to make it start wanting to produce some young suckers. And then you can go from there to kind of keep on training it and to make it stay a little bit fuller. But once it's a pretty large mature plant, I have not seen many of the button bushes like recover well from like a severe pruning. So no, it can tolerate it at a younger age, but once it gets to be a bit older and more tree-like, you probably want to just kind of keep with that. You may actually want to, if you have a really leggy specimen, you might actually want to turn it into something more aesthetically pleasing in the form of a tree, trying to like actually up prune it and try and shape it into more a tree-like specimen. If it's already pretty leggy, I would just kind of go the route that the plant's naturally trying to take. But if you get it early on, you can make a button bush get rejuvenated pretty easily when it's younger.
Great, thank you. A couple other pruning questions that came in, but we'll save those. And someone asked about, does proximity help when if you have a female spice bush, for example, and a male spice bush, in order to produce fruit? If planting them closer together, that'd be beneficial, or can they be across the yard from each other?
Well, they can be across the yard from each other, but the closer you have them, the better, because they're so early in spring that a lot of times that a lot of pollinators might not even be active yet. So you may be relying on pollinators, if it's an early year a bloom season like this year there wasn't a lot of bees on spice bush, at least at the site that I work at. Spice bush is almost done and the bees are just now coming out. So you would have been more reliant upon flies and beetles, things like that were a little bit more cold tolerant. And so the closer you have it, the better it is for those kind of species, because they're not reliable pollinators. They're not actively trying to go back and forth between plants like bees are. So to answer that, in like a shorter version, is that sometimes it's a lot better for spice bush to be closer together just because it's bloom time.
Great, thank you. We had you had mentioned girdling roots earlier, and someone asked if you could explain what that is for folks who don't know that term.
Yeah, so a girdling root is going to be one of like the main roots coming out of the root flare. So you have your main trunk coming down, and generally at ground level or right below ground level, you will have one of the main roots start to encircle. And I'll just like try and demonstrate with my fingers here. So like whereas roots should typically be going out from the main trunk, because of early on in its, in like a container or something like that, something caused the root to start circling. And just as the trunk grows in width, in girth, that girdling root goes around and it's still permanently there and it's not been pruned off. It's just going to eventually choke the tree because the outside part of the tree is the phloem, and that's where the energy is flowing from the leaves down to the roots. And basically that would get cut off. So, you might have a tree that's looking perfectly fine with a girdling root during the growing season. It goes dormant that year. The next year, spring rolls around and nothing's happening with your tree. Your tree's completely dead because none of the energy actually went back down to the roots the previous year.
Thank you so much for that.
One of the best ways to prune them is with early on with a pair of pruners or loppers. If it's really late in and you can see that the girdling root's already like digging into the trunk of the tree, you're going to want to use a wood chisel. So that you don't damage the tree with like a saw or something.
Okay, that makes good sense. And speaking of the kind of the damage that trees take and shrubs take when we do try to prune them, someone asked about treating the prune with a coating, or the tree prune with a coating. Is that something we should avoid doing?
Yes. Yeah. So that's just like an old bad practice of just assuming that we can do better than the plant at compartmentalizing for it. And so unfortunately, what happens if you do that is that the living tissue in there does need to dry out. So the plant cells are being decommissioned in a lot of that area that's been pruned off. And so all that moisture would then get trapped in it if you put a coating on there. So it does need to dry out so that that wood doesn't start to rot underneath that. And it's allowed to, dry out to where like once it does compartmentalize, it's dry wood on the interior of the tree. Yeah. So that it's an unfortunate thing that happens. It's not going to help anything. The only thing it could do is actually potentially harm the tree.
Okay, great, thank you. So, I mean, because that is like I think probably the hardest part, right, to native landscaping is unlearning the practices
Yeah.
that have been really popular for a long time, and so we're learning better, and so yeah, so we have to kind of question the things that we took for granted to some extent.
Yep.
Yeah, so thank you for clarifying that and why that's not so great. Um, there was a great question. Well, so that someone asked a specific question about cultivars versus a native, like something that might be close to it. How, what kinds of resource, like what advice do we have for when we see something that we like and it turns out to be a cultivar? How do we figure out how to come up with a native alternative? Like, do you have any advice that you could offer for this?
So I guess maybe I'm not understanding the question
That could be.
completely, but I mean, because there's cultivars of native plants. And so I mean, like if you just happen to buy a cultivar of a native plant, I mean, it's fine. Just you don't need to necessarily kill it. But trying to find street species is just the best route you could go, unless your space is just not suitable for it. That's why I was mentioning like dwarf specimens, dwarf cultivars can sometimes be really nice. Like I have a small backyard, and I don't have the room for a full-size river birch, but I put in a dwarf cultivar of river birch just so I could have a river birch still in my space. But there's nothing else different about that specimen. The leaves are still the same, flowers are still the same, that kind of stuff. Nothing else has really been affected. If if you are out and about and you're looking at native plants at the nursery and you notice like there's a special name on it, usually like in quotations, that's generally how that you're looking at a cultivar. So, keep an eye out for that. And so, you can always ask questions at the nursery too, if this is something that's been locally sourced, or if it's a cultivar, potentially, stuff like that. Sometimes, like the tags get mixed up and stuff like that. So it's always good to ask, anybody that might be there in the nursery if they know anything about where those plants came from.
Right.
Most people ordering at the nurseries know where the plants are coming from.
Yes, that's a good point. And yeah, I think that's important too. Yeah, remember that we can ask questions.
Yeah.
That we don't have to figure it out on our own. We can get clarification. And things definitely do get switched up. So good to be reminded to ask. So maybe one last, we're getting down to it, but the question that came up was, so just for folks who are asking, who are curious about, their particular conditions and such at their yard. A lot of those native plant guides that you mentioned, like the Grow Native guide, they have lists of what works well in shaded areas and that kind of thing. So there are plenty of resources to help you find the right fit for your conditions. So and those resources have been shared out and will be shared out with the recording link too. So keep an eye out for that. But thank you for that question. And then good questions. I think we're catching a lot of them kind of in a general way. So I think maybe the making making sure. I think we've kind of hit like the main kind of more general questions. And thank you again for sharing your contact information. So if folks need some extra help, they know where to find you. But also thank you for sharing all those great resources. Excuse me. Excuse me. So far I haven't looked up the second to last book that you shared, but all of the others, except for one, are available through St. Louis County Library.
Fantastic.
Shared catalog. So, and the one that isn't is available through Mobius, which if you're a library card holder, you have access to. So we have the resources. Thank you for sharing all those. A lot of them were new. I've sat through a lot of these programs over the last several years, and a lot of them were new to me too. So good stuff for us to explore.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, James, once again for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you all for being with us and asking your questions and being patient to ask questions. And we hope to see you tomorrow for the final program in the series. If not, we hope you catch up with it on YouTube. But thank you so much, Partners for Native Landscaping, for organizing tonight's webinar. Thank you for sharing your adorable puppy with us. We could all use a little puppy. It's a puppy time at this point in the evening. So thank you. And have a great night, everyone. Take care.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure.